An American warplane dropped an atomic bomb, called Fat Man, on the Japanese city of Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m. on August 9, 1945. The explosion, with a force equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT, instantly killed at least 30,000 people. That same day marked the official beginning of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. It was also the second atomic bomb dropped on Japan in 3 days, as the American government sought to force Japan's unconditional surrender and bring World War II to an end. The Soviet offensive was a strategic double-pincer movement, with forces attacking from the west, north, and east, extending over 2,730 miles from the Mongolian desert to the Sea of Japan. Since midnight, over 1 million Soviet troops, backed by armored units, air power, and naval forces, had begun advancing into Manchuria, the Japanese-controlled puppet state referred to as Manchukuo. This campaign would become the last major military operation of World War II. Additional accounts in World War II history highlight the Soviet Union's critical role in the conflict, especially the brutal battles on the Eastern Front. On August 9th, Japan's imperial headquarters issued an emergency announcement after border troops in Manchuria came under intense artillery fire and ground assault. The statement acknowledged the Soviet declaration of war and their entry into Manchuria, but downplayed the scale of the invasion. In reality, a massive Soviet force of 1.5 million troops, supported by Mongolian cavalry and thousands of aircraft, had already launched a full-scale offensive. These units began attacking Japanese positions in North Korea and Manchuria with the aid of river flotillas and combined arms operations involving tanks, infantry, and air power. Following the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, the Soviet Pacific Fleet was ready to reclaim territories lost to Japan decades earlier, including the Sakhalin and Kuril Islands, and Port Arthur, a key strategic port. Soviet leadership, particularly Stalin, saw this moment as an opportunity to secure regional influence and economic gains while also avenging Russia's earlier defeat by Japan. The first time in modern history an Asian power had defeated a European nation. In April 1941, Japan and the Soviet Union signed a 5-year neutrality pact, which served both countries. Nazi Germany's advances in Europe raised fears of a global conflict, and Japan wanted to protect its rear flank while expanding south and east. The USSR, meanwhile, wanted to avoid conflict in Asia as it focused on the threat from Germany. Confident that his eastern borders were secure, Stalin concentrated his military resources in the west until Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. The Soviet Union honored its neutrality agreement so strictly that American B-29 bombers, making emergency landings on Soviet territory after bombing runs over Japan, were detained and not allowed to rejoin the war effort. By 1944, however, the United States no longer favored peace on the Soviet-Manchurian border. Over 1 million Japanese soldiers in Manchuria and eastern China posed a persistent threat. The U.S. had already deployed about 250,000 personnel to support Chiang Kai-shek's ineffective nationalist forces in their war against Japan. But by December 1944, U.S. commanders concluded that neither Chiang's army nor Mao Zedong's guerrillas were willing or able to expel the Japanese. Both Chinese factions were more focused on their post-war rivalry than on defeating Japan. Washington, seeing no viable alternative, turned to the Soviets for help. During the winter of 1944 to 1945, the U.S. increased diplomatic pressure on the USSR to commit to the war against Japan. American military leaders believed Soviet intervention would reduce the number of Japanese forces they would face in the Pacific. Stalin's promise to send 60 divisions against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat was a key incentive for Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. However, U.S. leaders knew the Soviets would only act in exchange for substantial rewards. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin laid out his demands for joining the war in the Pacific. the return of the Kuril Islands, the southern half of Sakhalin Island, the lease of Port Arthur, access to Dalian, control of the southern Manchurian railway, and recognition of Soviet influence over Outer Mongolia. Roosevelt accepted these terms on February 8th without consulting China, and Chiang Kai-shek was later expected to approve them in return for Soviet recognition of his regime. By June 1945, after a brutal campaign in Okinawa, American leaders were desperate to avoid a mainland invasion of Japan. Atomic weapons had not yet been considered. Instead, the U.S. hoped to win through economic blockade, incendiary bombing, and Soviet intervention. But the successful atomic test on July 16th changed the equation. President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt, became less inclined to support Soviet expansion in Asia. Japan's war capabilities were already collapsing due to the blockade and sustained air attacks. General Curtis LeMay's bombing campaign had already devastated Japanese cities, including the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th, which alone killed about 200,000 civilians. These developments made an Allied invasion of Japan less necessary, and some U.S. officials began to question the value of Soviet involvement. Nevertheless, Stalin pursued his own objectives, particularly the expansion of Soviet influence in the Far East, as agreed at Yalta. Japan's initial reaction to the Soviet invasion on August 9th showed either complete unawareness or unwillingness to face reality. Many in Tokyo believed the Soviets wouldn't launch an attack until late 1945 or 1946, despite clear signs of Soviet preparations. Japan's Kwantung Army in Manchuria, commanded by General Otozo Yamada, was not ready. Its best units had been redeployed to defend Okinawa and Kyushu. Several top officers were absent, air support was weak, and defensive preparations were minimal. The Soviet attack exploited this vulnerability, bringing swift and decisive pressure to bear on a Japanese military already stretched beyond its limits. Tens of thousands of refugees from the Japanese home islands moved to Manchuria in early 1945, bringing all their belongings in the belief that it would be a safe haven. Surprisingly, no steps were taken to evacuate them, based on the idea that such actions would signal defeatism. Stalin aimed for vast territorial expansion and was willing to pay a heavy price. The Soviets prepared medical supplies for 540,000 casualties from the invasion, anticipating 160,000 fatalities based on Japan's estimated strength. In the spring of 1945, Stalin reinforced the Soviet presence on the Manchurian border. After years of maintaining 40 divisions there, another 40 were transported east by about 3,000 locomotives across the Trans-Siberian Railway between May and June. Troops marched the final 200 miles across the Mongolian desert in scorching heat. The United States supported the effort by providing arms and supplies, including 500 new Sherman tanks delivered to Soviet ports. Deception and camouflage were heavily employed as Soviet forces neared the border. High-ranking Soviet officers used false identities and removed their insignia. The 6th Guards Tank Army picked up new Soviet-made equipment, leaving its old gear behind in Czechoslovakia. For the first time during the war, the Soviets created a completely independent theater of operations. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, commanding the Soviet Far East Command, devised a straightforward yet ambitious plan to encircle Japanese defenses on 3 fronts and potentially capture Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and even northern Hokkaido. The First Far East Front, led by Marshal Kirill Meretskov and composed of over 586,000 troops, attacked from the east. The Trans-Baikal Front, with 654,000 troops under Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, executed a pincer movement from the west, while the Second Far East Front under General Maxim Porkayev supported operations in the northeast with 337,000 men. The strategy relied on rapid movement to outpace Japanese reactions. Japan's Kwantung Army, with a real strength of around 713,000 second-line troops in 24 infantry divisions, 9 infantry brigades, and 2 tank brigades, was estimated by Moscow to exceed 1 million men. They were to be denied any chance to form new defenses. The Manchukuo Army, formed by local Chinese collaborators and numbering around 170,000, lacked the capability and will to aid Japan significantly. An additional 44,000 Mongolian cavalrymen supported Japanese positions in Inner Mongolia. In total, there were about 289,000 Japanese soldiers scattered across the Kurils, Sakhalin, Korea, and other areas. Many of the Kwantung Army's remaining forces were poorly trained conscripts or reservists, short on equipment and supplies. Soviet armored strength was considerable, with 1,852 self-propelled guns and 3,744 tanks. Japanese defenses were focused on southeast Manchuria in the Tongwa area. The plan was to delay Soviet forces through difficult terrain and resistance. However, Japanese preparations came too late. Fortifications and redeployments weren't completed by June. Millions of Manchurian civilians were left unaware they would face the Soviet onslaught alone, and even lower-ranking officers were kept in the dark. The Japanese Air Force had 1,800 aircraft, but only 50 were frontline ready. Their ground forces had 5,360 artillery pieces and 1,155 armored vehicles, mostly light tanks and cars. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had long opposed occupying Manchuria, contributed nothing to the defense. Over the previous 3 years, Japan had redeployed its best units and equipment to the Pacific, leaving the Kwantung Army with little mobility, no modern anti-tank weapons, and just 100 rounds per soldier. Japanese strategists wrongly assumed any Soviet attack would follow old rail lines into key towns due to the natural barriers of the Grand Khingan Mountains and the Mongolian Desert. While the Soviets did use these routes, their main assault came through the supposedly impassable southern section of the mountains. Japanese intelligence failed to track the size of Soviet troop movements to the Siberian front. Marshal Vasilevsky originally planned for the attack to start on August 11th. But after learning of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, he advanced the schedule to August 9th to ensure the Soviets physically occupied territory before Japan surrendered. At 12:10 a.m. on August 9th, Soviet units crossed into Inner Mongolia and Manchuria without preliminary artillery or air bombardment. The 6th Guards Tank Army led the way in 2 wide columns, and by nightfall had advanced 93 kilometers into Manchuria. Resistance was light, with the only major opposition on the left flank where the Soviet 36th Army encountered defended border positions. Inner Mongolian cavalry units were quickly overcome by Soviet Mongolian tank and cavalry forces, which advanced 55 miles on the right flank. When Japanese forces failed to respond meaningfully by the evening of August 9th, the Soviets began preparations to seize the mountain passes. Despite challenges in resupplying fuel, their progress remained rapid. Fuel was soon airlifted to forward units beginning August 11th. After crossing the mountains, the Trans-Baikal front advanced on Mukden and Changchun. By August 14th, the Soviet 36th Army continued besieging the Halor defenses. Though considered only 15% combat effective, Japan's 80th Independent Mixed Brigade fought fiercely and required 2 Soviet divisions and heavy artillery to defeat. The final 3,827 Japanese defenders surrendered on August 18th. The Inner Mongolian 3rd, 5th, and 7th Cavalry Divisions mounted strong resistance at Kanba on August 15th, but were defeated after 2 days by Soviet Mongolian forces, who captured the city and took 1,634 prisoners. Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Kalgan by August 18th. Despite the Japanese High Command having already ordered the Kwantung Army's surrender, Kalgan's defenders held out until August 21st. The Soviet Mongolian group then advanced into Beijing, joining forces with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army. The 6th Guards Tank Army launched an offensive on August 15th, facing opposition from Mongolian cavalry and remnants of the Japanese 117th and 63rd Infantry Divisions. While the 5th Guards Tank Corps and 9th Guards Mechanized Corps moved southeast into Mukden, the 7th Guards Mechanized Corps advanced east toward Changchun. Both cities were reached on August 19th and secured 2 days later. Soviet airborne forces landed in both locations. Due to fuel shortages, the 6th Guards Tank Army was later moved by rail to Port Arthur and Dalian. With the Trans-Baikal front having achieved its goals ahead of schedule, organized Japanese resistance effectively ended by August 18th. From that point forward, Soviet efforts focused on disarming Japanese forces, taking prisoners, and securing control over central and southern Manchuria. The 117th Infantry Division and other Japanese units stationed in central Manchuria, or those that had withdrawn there when the Soviet offensive began, never posed a significant threat to the Soviets. Conditions on the Trans-Baikal front differed greatly from those on Marshal Merezkov's First Far Eastern Front. The Japanese border regions in eastern Manchuria were more heavily fortified than those in the west. The First Far Eastern Front's 435-mile stretch from the town of Amun on the Ussuri River to the Sea of Japan was shorter. Some defensive complexes were made from reinforced concrete. At 1 a.m. on August 9th, amid terrible weather, the Soviets launched a surprise attack along the front without any preliminary artillery bombardment. Many of their attacks targeted areas the Japanese believed impassable for large armies. The Soviet Fifth Army, comprising 12 divisions and 692 armored vehicles, led the main assault, striking the front and northern flank of the Volinsk center of resistance. This position was held by a battalion of the Japanese 124th Infantry Division, supported by 3 rifle corps. Each Soviet rifle division was backed by tanks and self-propelled artillery. By nightfall, the Fifth Army had pushed 15 kilometers into the Japanese rear, creating a 25-mile-wide breach in their fortifications. Remaining Japanese strongholds in Volinsk, Suifenho, and Luentai were quickly overcome by follow-on units. The heavily defended road junction at Mutanchiang, an important communications center and headquarters of the Japanese First Area Army, was the primary objective. Merezkov, impressed with the progress of his Fifth Army, ordered the assault on the city to be accelerated. On the evening of August 11th, one of the few multi-division battles in Manchuria unfolded as the Fifth Army reached Mutanchiang's outer defenses. The 1st Red Banner Army advanced on the northern flank to support the offensive. Japanese forces from the 126th and parts of the 135th Infantry Divisions waited in the dense forests. To move forward, the Soviets had to construct roads through this terrain. Many Japanese soldiers, unaware of the surrender order, fought to the end. Nearly half of the Soviet casualties during the campaign occurred during the intense 2-day battle that began on August 15th. Soviet tanks eventually reached the 126th Division's headquarters. In a desperate response, Japanese transport troops launched suicide attacks, each man carrying a 15-kilogram bomb and destroying 1 tank apiece. On the evening of August 16th, the 1st Red Banner Army began its northwest advance toward Harbin, while the 5th Army moved south and southwest toward Chikihar and Ningan. On August 18th, the day Japan's surrender was officially announced, both Soviet armies were tasked with processing surrendering Japanese units. By August 20th, elements of the 1st Red Banner Army entered Harbin, linking up with amphibious troops from the 15th Army, 2nd Far Eastern Front, and Soviet airborne units. Simultaneously, Soviet forces pushed west and southwest in the southern part of the 1st Far Eastern Front's operational area to sever Japanese links between Korea and Manchuria. In anticipation of Japan's surrender, the Soviet 25th Army, supported by the Navy, carried out amphibious landings and overland advances to assert control along Korea's northeastern coast. Red Army troops reached the 38th parallel, the agreed-upon division line for Korea, by the end of August. Operations by the Second Far Eastern Front covered a vast area with varied terrain. Fierce fighting occurred when Japanese units like the 134th, 123rd Infantry Divisions, and the 135th Independent Mixed Brigade resisted. General Purkayev divided his army into 3 sectors, each with distinct objectives. The main thrust came through the center, where 3 rifle divisions of Lieutenant General S.K. Mamanov's 15th Army crossed the Amur River and broke through Japanese defenses at Fuyin, advancing along the Sangari River through a mountain pass to join the First Far Eastern Front near Harbin. Despite many challenges, the Second Far Eastern Front successfully tied down Japanese forces in northern Manchuria and prevented their reinforcement of the southern front. The Second Red Banner Army faced difficulties crossing the Amur River as it took up a position on Mamanov's right flank. The Soviets encountered relentless bad weather, harsh terrain, and strong resistance. Meanwhile, Soviet amphibious forces attacked Pacific Islands promised to them at the Yalta Conference. Around 8,000 troops were sent to the Kurils, 500 nautical miles away. Of the 25,000 Japanese troops in the northern Kurils, 8,480 were stationed on Shumshu Island. Major General Fusaki Tsutsumi, commanding the island, listened to the Emperor's surrender broadcast on August 14th and decided not to resist American forces. However, Soviet troops launched a surprise assault on August 18th without warning. The Red Army, inexperienced in amphibious operations, struggled during the landing. Japanese shore batteries opened fire as Soviet ships approached at 5:30 a.m., damaging several vessels. Communications failed, and a Soviet destroyer was hit, likely by Japan's last kamikaze attack of the war. A Japanese tank counterattack gained some ground. On August 19th, the Soviets were ordered to speed up the conquest of Shumshu. That day, a Japanese envoy arrived to negotiate surrender, but some coastal guns continued to fire and were silenced brutally. After 614 Japanese deaths, the island surrendered on August 21st. Sakhalin Island presented fewer challenges in its northern half, which was Soviet territory, but the southern portion had been occupied by Japan since 1905. The island was large and difficult to traverse, covered in forests and swamps. Soviet forces began their assault on August 11th, but faced strong resistance. The strategic town of Khotan was only captured after heavy fighting. Infantry had to advance on foot, as bad weather grounded air support and bogged down tanks. On August 16th, the Japanese launched human wave counterattacks, which the Soviets repelled with severe casualties. The next day, Soviet troops used artillery and airstrikes to clear the remaining defenders, and by August 17th, Japanese resistance in the border zone collapsed. Scattered garrisons continued to resist. On August 20th, Japanese troops opened fire as Soviet forces landed in the port of Myoka. The fog hampered visibility, and some defenders fired from concealed positions. Civilians had been terrified by propaganda warning of Soviet brutality, leading many to flee into the forests or seek transport to Hokkaido. Some women, believing they would be raped or murdered, were particularly frightened. Soviet reports later claimed they had killed 300 and captured 600 Japanese in Myoka. Sakhalin was fully secured by August 26th, 4 days behind schedule. Stalin had even more ambitious plans. Before the invasion of Manchuria, the Soviets had planned to land in Hokkaido and take control of its northern half. On August 18th, Vasilevsky requested approval from Moscow to proceed with this landing. For 2 days, there was no response. Then, on August 23rd, Stalin gave preliminary approval. However, following a protest from U.S. President Truman, Moscow rescinded the plan on August 22nd. Instead of escalating tensions, Washington rushed Marine forces to key positions on China's coast to block Soviet advances until Chiang Kai-shek's forces could arrive. U.S. support was crucial in helping the nationalists regain control of eastern China in late 1945. The Soviets claimed to have inflicted 674,000 Japanese casualties through death, injury, or capture during the campaign in Manchuria and the islands. The Red Army lost 12,031 men and had 24,424 wounded. These figures were comparable to American casualties during the Okinawa campaign. Japan officially reported only 21,000 deaths, though the real toll likely approached 80,000. Chiang Kai-shek urged the Soviets to remain in Manchuria temporarily to give his forces time to establish control. Despite international fears of a permanent occupation, Stalin had pledged to recognize Chiang's government as the legitimate authority in China. Between January and May 1946, Soviet forces systematically dismantled industrial facilities and shipped equipment back to the USSR, claiming it as war reparations from Japan. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese prisoners, both soldiers and civilians, were taken to Siberia and forced into labor under dire conditions. Chiang's strategic mistake in occupying Manchuria became apparent when the Chinese Civil War resumed. His forces were isolated and American aid proved ineffective against rampant corruption. Except for the island of Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, Chiang lost control. By 1949, Mao Zedong ruled China. Ironically, Japan's wartime slogan, "Asia for Asians," came true in a way its originators never intended. Initially, many Chinese welcomed the Soviets. But following the Japanese defeat, Manchurian women experienced horrific treatment at the hands of Red Army troops, similar to abuses previously seen in Germany and Eastern Europe. Even communist guerrilla leaders expressed shock at the behavior of their supposed allies. One fighter remarked that the Soviets, once seen as brothers in arms, showed little respect for the local population.